Um, Thank you all for coming to this lovely fMRI Neuroscience summer series. We're going to talk about real-time fMRI challenges and uses. So this is mainly going to be a talk about neurofeedback, which is one of the things we can do with real-time fMRI. And actually, a few months ago, we hosted a workshop here at NIH, which was called Critical Examination of Real-Time fMRI Neurofeedback. And we invited all the big people, and for me, the most important word in this title was a critical examination of fMRI neurofeedback, and I'm not sure that entirely happened at that workshop, so we're going to try and do that a little bit now, especially since the theme of this talk series is controversies. Okay, so we're going to start with some background. What is neurofeedback? And specifically, how can we provide feedback with fMRI? So neurofeedback, broadly speaking, is just translating a signal from the brain to a signal that subjects can perceive. Right? This can be a visual signal or an auditory signal, and it doesn't matter how you collect that signal from the brain. You can do it with EEG or with invasive methods or using real-time fMRI, which is what we'll be discussing today. So real-time fMRI is actually kind of new-ish. Usually fMRI data is processed post-acquisition. In '95, Bob Cox came out with this great paper showing us how we can do real-time fMRI. And what real-time fMRI does is it allows us to look at fMRI data online during the scan. And that's how we can do neurofeedback, because we need to be able to give people feedback during the scan and not just after the scan. So the whole field of neurofeedback has really taken off in the last 2 decades maybe. And this is where Bob Cox's paper came out, and you can see that real-time fMRI neurofeedback has been slowly taking over the field, right? Because it's the best kind of neurofeedback. So how do we do neurofeedback with fMRI? So I actually looked at this figure. I've been using this for a while, and I looked at it a little bit more closely recently. And I got this from a paper. And I was wondering in what world this and this coexist in the same universe. But never mind. So what we do is we put people in the scanner, right? And then we look at their brain activity in real time. We do some kind of calculation with the brain activity, depending on what we want to feedback. And then we translate this activity into a signal that subjects can perceive, right? So this is another example. We can look at this area here, for instance, and this is the height of the signal that we measure with fMRI from this ROI that we defined. And now we can tell people, for instance, raise the ball, and the ball represents the height of the signal, right? So the activity in that area. And then we show people, and then people sometimes do blocks where you tell them, raise the ball, now rest, now raise the ball, now rest. Right? And this is kind of a standard neurofeedback experiment, or at least this is what people used to do with neurofeedback, especially when it was just beginning. So what do we need to do neurofeedback? We need a system that can reconstruct fMRI images in real time, right? We need software that can communicate rapidly with the server, access the images and pre-process them. AFNI will do all of that for you, right? This is the AFNI plugin, and you can put in all of your data, and you can tell it what you want it to do with the signal, and it will do that for you, right? And then we need a program. So now we have the pre-processed data that AFNI gives us. So now we need a program that will run an algorithm on the images, determine the feedback, and display it. So this is really the meat of the neurofeedback, because this is where what kind of neurofeedback that you want to do comes in. So you decide which part of the signal you want to look at, what you want to do with it, what kind of feedback you want to give the participants. Okay? So, and I'll get into that in a moment. What I want to talk about just for a second is pre-processing. The basic steps that you really have to do is register everything to a common space. So you need your anatomical and your functional data. You need them to be in the same space. You sometimes have predefined regions of interest. You want them to be consistent across days or scans if you're bringing people in for multiple scans. You want to do motion correction. And then there's a bunch of other pre-processing steps that you might be able to do or you might not. And there's other people will talk more about this kind of pre-processing. So you can do physiological noise regression. You can do detrending. You might do optimally combined with the echoes and have multiple echoes. These are all things that you might or might not do, and other people will cover this, I think, in the other talks in this series. So what are the limitations of doing neurofeedback with real-time fMRI? So the first one is that even though processing can be fast, the fMRI signal is inherently slow. Okay? So our acquisition is slow. We get a full picture of the entire brain once every 2-3 seconds on average. Right? We can go down to 1 second, but it's really difficult to go beyond that. But even if we could go faster with the acquisition, the bold is slow, so our signal is slow. So it takes about 6 seconds to peak. The whole wave takes about 10 seconds. So we're limited in what we're feedbacking because the event we're providing feedback on happened a few seconds ago in the brain by the time that we could record it. So this is one of the main limitations of real-time fMRI neurofeedback. The other main limitation is that fMRI data is noisy, and we're limited in the amount of preprocessing we can do in real time. There is global signal in the data. Some of it is real global signal, and there's lots of papers about real global signal in fMRI. Some of it is noise. So motion causes global noise across the brain, right? And, okay, so these were the main limitations that we have. So now let's talk about what we can feedback, okay, and what we can do with this given these limitations. So the first thing we can do is like the example I showed you before. We can look at single regions. We can look at the activity in those regions and ask people to modify the activity, bring it up or bring it down, right? Or control it. We can ask them to do both. We can ask them to bring it up and then a little bit later bring it down, up again, that kind of thing. By the way, if anybody has any questions during this talk, then please ask me. If anything is unclear, please let me know. And there's lots of papers that do this single region kind of modulation, right? From all kinds of different fields. Amygdala is a big one. People really like to do feedback of the amygdala. So all kinds of stuff. A slightly more advanced kind of neurofeedback is using classifier output. So this is one example. This is a really nice example of what a classifier is, okay? So say we have two categories, right? And we have many voxels, say n voxels, right? And these voxels each respond slightly differently to each of these categories, right? So one might respond slightly more to the bottles, and one might respond slightly more to the shoes. And when you look at this, you get this pattern of activity for bottles and this pattern of activity for shoes. And you can do this across several runs and average it. And then you can build this classifier, right? Which will tell you, looking at this kind of multi-voxel pattern, if what the participant is seeing right now is more likely to be a bottle or more likely to be a shoe, right? This is a very, very basic introduction to classifiers, okay? So once you train the classifier can look at an image of the brain and say, is it more likely that this person is currently seeing category A or category B, okay? And we can use that to give feedback. So say you're trying to train people to have activity that looks more like shoes or more like bottles. You can give them positive feedback whenever their brain activity looks more like shoes or more like bottles. Is that clear? Kind of? A little bit? Okay. Okay, and the third thing we can feedback is correlations between regions. Okay? So brain regions don't usually operate in isolation. And instead of giving feedback on the activity of a single brain region, we can look at activity between different brain regions and the correlations between them and give feedback on that. Okay? This is actually not trivial because calculating correlations takes time, and we only have a data measurement every few seconds. So it's actually pretty difficult to measure correlations with fMRI in real time, but there are some ways around that, and we'll talk about that. This is actually true of the classifier as well. Classifier data on single time points can be kind of noisy. Okay, so this was all background, basically. But now the big question is, why should we do neurofeedback, right? So what can we do with neurofeedback that we couldn't do otherwise, that we can't do with traditional fMRI techniques? So for this, we can think about what are the goals of neurofeedback, right? And there are a few main goals. One is for clinical applications. This is what people usually think of when they think of neurofeedback. And there's been a lot of work on clinical applications of neurofeedback, from anxiety to ADHD, alcohol use, depression, schizophrenia. There's been a ton about this. So that's one main use of neurofeedback. The other thing people use neurofeedback for is to enhance performance, right? So this is an example of a paper that did exactly that. This is a kind of atypical kind of neurofeedback. This is more like closed-loop brain training, okay? So what they did here is they trained a classifier on a multivariate pattern analysis. So they have a classifier for when people are looking at faces and when they're looking at houses. Okay, so they can tell if your brain activity now looks more like when you see faces or more like when you see houses. Okay, and what they do is they put people in the scanner and then they show them this kind of combined image of a face over a house. So really they're activating both the face regions and the house regions. And they're trying to train them to pay attention to only one category. So say they tell them pay attention to the houses, okay? Or to the faces. And then they look at the activity in real time, at the classifier output in real time. And if it looks like they're paying more attention to the houses than they are to the faces, and they're supposed to be paying attention to faces, then they make the houses more apparent, right? So they make it more difficult. And if they're paying attention to the faces when they're supposed to be paying attention to the faces, then they make it easier. So the faces, they can change this mix of face-house superimposition, right? So whenever they're doing what they're supposed to do, then they make it the task easier by making it seem more like the category that they're supposed to be paying attention to. And this is a way of kind of a closed-loop brain training, where they're using your brain state in real time to change the stimulus that you're getting in order to maximize your performance. And then they show that this works. So the people who were trained with real neurofeedback did much better in a post-behavioral test than the people who weren't trained with neurofeedback. Okay? So they somehow managed to train you to keep your attention on the category that you're supposed to be attending to. Any questions about this? No? Yes?
So what part of the brain was used as feedback? Is it like...
They were using like FFA PPA. Yeah. So they're using the activity from the relevant brain regions.
I also have a question. So
Yeah.
the fact that they're making it harder when they're like not really being able to distinguish the two, why would you make it harder when they're already having a difficult time distinguishing the two?
So I think you could really go either way in this kind of training. I personally probably would have chosen the opposite approach, which is what you said, like to try and keep them attentive by making it easier when they're having trouble. But they chose this for reasons of their own, but it worked. So, you know. There are other problems, I think, with choosing this approach, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. Okay, so that's the second possible goal of neurofeedback. And then the third goal, which I think is actually the most interesting, but very few people are looking into this, is to investigate causality, or to understand the relationship between networks and behavior. So this is a bit of a complicated idea. I'm going to go into this in a second. We're just going to do a brief segue, where I'm going to explain the difference between explicit or task-based neurofeedback, or implicit or covert neurofeedback, okay? Where the main question here is, should we tell participants how to control the feedback? Should we tell participants what we're doing, and should we give them a strategy for how to control the feedback? So what most people do is what I'm calling task-based neurofeedback or explicit neurofeedback, where they tell people what they're doing and they give them a strategy to control the feedback with. So for instance, in the Face House paper, they told people, you have to concentrate. If you see it slipping away, then try concentrating more on the category you're supposed to be concentrating on. And that one is even more complicated because the stimulus itself is activating those same regions, right? But for instance, people train the amygdala and they tell you try to think happy thoughts or try to control your fear levels. And that is supposed to help you control the signal. So that's what I'm calling task-based neurofeedback. So the main problem with this is that it doesn't bypass behavior, right? Because you're giving them a task. They're doing a task which is supposed to modulate the signal that you're interested in, okay? So it can't address the question of causality, which again I'll go back to in a second. And it's difficult to disentangle the effects of this task that they're performing from the effects of the neurofeedback. So if I'm feedbacking amygdala, and I tell you, think happy thoughts, right? And I see activity in the amygdala go up or down or whatever I'm trying to do. And then I see that overall, over time, I got you to make the amygdala more reactive. And I'm giving you good feedback. Whenever you get the amygdala up, then I'm saying good, 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 and the thermometer is going up, and you're receiving good feedback. But I don't know if activity in the amygdala is changing because of the good feedback, or because you're doing the task of thinking happy thoughts, right? So it's difficult to know what the effect of the task is and what the effect of the feedback is. And I'll talk a little bit about this, why this is really important in a bit later. It's inflexible and limited because you can only do feedback on things that you know what the strategy would be, right? So if you're looking at a region where you don't know what it does, or you're looking at a network and you're not sure what would activate this exact network, then you can't do this kind of feedback because you can't tell people how to control the signal. It potentially underestimates the extent of plasticity, and this I'll go into in a second. And the main problem with this is that you don't necessarily have to do this in an fMRI machine, which is a very expensive piece of equipment, right? If I know what will make you modulate the signal, and I can give you a strategy to do it, then you can practice the strategy outside the scanner. And while the feedback could be helpful in terms of telling you how well you're doing, because real-time fMRI is noisy and the feedback I'm giving you is delayed, it's not necessarily better than just practicing outside the scanner, right? Someone would have to show that doing this with feedback is definitely better than doing it without feedback. That's not a trivial point. Anybody have questions on this? Okay. So going back to the plasticity thing, say you have a network that is aberrant, right? This is what people usually try to train when they do clinical neurofeedback. So say you think that activity in the amygdala doesn't go up as much when you're thinking happy thoughts as it should, right? Then if you're just thinking happy thoughts, then you're activating the amygdala the way you're always activating the amygdala, which is not in the best way, which is why you want to change these networks, because they're not behaving the way they should, right? So say you broke a bone and they set it and they don't set it correctly, right? Then if you just walk on it, it's not going to get better. Or if you have to say now the muscles are weak, and if you just walk, you're not strengthening the right muscles. You have to go to physiotherapy so they can tell you what the right exercises are to do so you can strengthen the muscles in the correct way. You can strengthen the correct muscles. If you just keep walking, it's not going to get better. So that was the whole plasticity thing. If everything you're doing is explicit, then you're just activating the same networks that were bad to begin with. Yeah? Okay, so what happens if we don't give subjects a strategy? Right? We just tell them, here's a signal, try and control it. So then it's extremely flexible, right? Because then at least theoretically you could do whatever you want. You could give feedback from whatever network you wanted to, and people would either learn to control it or they wouldn't. Right? And there's no way you could do this without fMRI. You can't tell people to practice something that has no strategy outside an fMRI machine or without neurofeedback because they wouldn't know what they're doing. This way you can do things that you can't do in any other way. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example. This is one of the coolest studies that was ever published on neurofeedback. This is the first study that did this implicit kind of training. So the background to this is that there's been a lot of talk in the literature about visual perceptual learning. Visual perceptual learning is when you train on a particular task, say for instance, recognizing red apples in an orchard, right? And it tends to be very specific. It doesn't generalize well across different things. If you're very good at picking out red apples, you're not necessarily good at picking out yellow bananas. Right? It's a very specific kind of learning. Which is what I said. And it often correlates with changes in visual areas, but we don't know if it's because of the task or the fact that those areas changed made you better at the task. Right? It's like a correlation causation question. So this is what I was talking about, if you can use neurofeedback to study causation. Okay, so anybody not know this example? Anybody? Everyone knows it? Can you see what's in the picture? So if anybody doesn't know this picture, this is a Dalmatian. Here is its head. This is its body. Its tail is here. This is one leg. It's like two legs, right? So most of you have probably seen this. It's a very famous picture. But once you've seen this picture, then you instantly recognize it whenever you see it again. Right? So the question they wanted to ask was, is early visual cortex plastic enough to cause this visual perceptual learning? So if we make a change in visual cortex, will this entail visual perceptual learning? So what they wanted to do was to induce a change in a very specific manner in early visual cortex in V1, without exposing V1 to the stimuli that would cause this change. Okay? So you probably all know that there are orientation columns in V1, right? So neurons in V1 respond best to a certain orientation. So when you present Gabor stimuli, which are basically these circles with lines at a particular orientation, these induce a very specific pattern of activation in V1, right? And each orientation will produce a different pattern of activity in V1, okay? Okay, so this is the study. They brought people in for a behavioral test. So they show these Gabors. They're shown at a lower contrast than what they show here. So they're very difficult to see. They flash them for a second, and then they ask you to report what the orientation was. And there's 3 possible orientations, and you have to report which orientation you saw. And this is actually a very difficult task. So they have this behavioral task, and then people get a score on how well they do on the behavioral task. And then they bring them in, and they show them these Gabors at each of these 3 orientations, and they use that to build the classifier. Okay, so now the classifier can look at your brain activity in V1 and say which orientation you are most likely to be seeing. Okay? Then they bring people back, and they don't show them anything. They just show them this green dot, right? Gray screen, green dot, and they say, try and make this target, which will be shown a few seconds later, try to make it as big as possible. This is your reward circle. Try to make the reward circle as big as possible. The bigger the reward circle, the more money you'll get. Okay, but they're not seeing any of these Gabors. They're only seeing the gray screen and then this green disk. But what's happening is, for each person, they have a target orientation. Okay, so say this one. And whenever activity in V1 is similar to this, then they get a bigger green circle. So the more likely the classifier is to say that activity in V1 is similar to this target Gabor, the bigger the green circle. Okay? So this is really what they're doing, is they're modulating spontaneous activity. Because there's spontaneous activity in V1 all the time, and sometimes this spontaneous activity will look like seeing this kind of Gabor, and other times it'll look like seeing other kinds of Gabor, it won't look like anything at all. And what they're trying to do is reinforce this spontaneous activity so that there's more spontaneous activity that looks like this target Gabor. This is kind of tricky. So is everyone clear about this? Any questions? No? Okay. And what they show is that this works. So people are more likely to have spontaneous activity in V1 that looks like the target Gabor over time, just from getting this feedback. So this is a kind of implicit learning, right? This is the kind of implicit neurofeedback. And not only do they get more of this spontaneous activity that looks like that particular target Gabor, they also get better at identifying that Gabor. So they bring them back for a post-training behavioral test, right? And you can see that they don't change in reporting the correct orientation for any of the other Gabors. They only get better at reporting the orientation for their target Gabor, which they were trained on. Yeah? Good? Okay, so why is this so important? Why is this so special, apart from the fact that it's super cool? Because the problem we have with the kind of explicit or task-based neurofeedback is that it's really difficult to disentangle task effects from neurofeedback effects. So it's really hard to know if it was really neurofeedback that was driving the change. So this is a really strong example. So this paper was published about a year ago. What they did was, it was a randomized control trial of real-time fMRI neurofeedback to treat depression. And they had 2 groups. They had a neurofeedback group and they had a control group. And for the neurofeedback group, they gave them neurofeedback from areas that they thought were correlated with depression, right? And for the control group, they got feedback from a completely different area of the brain, which has nothing to do with depression. And they were told, and they weren't told how to control the feedback. They were just told to try and control the feedback. And people got better. So people did really well in controlling the feedback, but they also got better. So they did, these are their depression scores at the beginning of the study, and these are the depression scores 12 weeks and 18 weeks after the study, and both groups got much better. They were much less depressed. They had really high remission rates. These are well above chance, right? So both neurofeedback seemed to have helped both these groups. But one group was getting feedback that had nothing to do with depression. So it was something about the feedback trial itself, like the study itself. Maybe it was coming in and being told how well they're doing. Maybe it was being in this really high-tech machine and feeling like they're controlling their own brain. There was something about this that was helping their depression, but it couldn't have been the feedback itself. It couldn't have been the change in the networks that people thought were relevant. Yeah? Okay, so this all brings us to caution when using neurofeedback, right? So many of the conditions that are targeted by neurofeedback are very amenable to placebo effects, depression, pain, anxiety, right? These all respond very well to placebo. And it's possible that the feedback we're giving is all just a very strong placebo. If they're given an explicit strategy, or if the feedback is not orthogonal to the network we're training, right? If the feedback activates the network that you're trying to train, then it's impossible to decouple the effects of the training from the feedback effects, right? Is that clear? In such a case, you might need multiple control groups. This is almost impossible to do. Neurofeedback studies are very expensive, they're very long. It's difficult to get lots of people. It's very difficult to get multiple control groups. Right? So you have to be very, very careful when designing the experiment. And then you might argue, well, it doesn't matter, right? Like in the depression, they got better. So it doesn't matter if it was the feedback itself or it was some other aspect of the training that made them better. We are clinicians. All we want to do is make people better. And we don't care. And if neurofeedback works, then it works, and that's great. Right? But that's not true. It's actually very important to know what aspect of the training was working, even if all you're interested in is clinical effect. Because if it was a placebo effect, if it was just this feeling of controlling your brain, then you can put them in an EEG and have them control alpha waves for a fraction of the cost with a similar effect. Right? So you need to know what part of the training is working, even if all you care about is clinical outcome. Okay? Okay, so this is the second and last part about the neurofeedback. This is kind of a summary. What do we know about what we can do with neurofeedback, and what do we not know yet? Okay. So what we know is that implicit learning works, right? I showed you that. We also know that, in fact, it doesn't even have to be consciously directed. You don't have to be trying for it to work. So this is a study I did a few years ago. We brought people in. We put them in the scanner. And we looked at FFA and PPA. These are two visual areas. FFA is the face area. PPA is the house area. So two very well-described visual areas. And we just trained them on the difference between the signal, right? So we were looking at activity in these two regions at every time point. And we had people divided into a faces good group and a faces bad group. And for the faces good group, then if activity in the face area was higher than activity in the house area, then they would get a good sound. And if activity in the house area was higher than the face area, then they would get a bad sound. Right? And the opposite for the other group, right? And we told them that this is a study about reward, and they didn't think that they were controlling these sounds in any way. We told them that they would win sounds for the good, they would win money for the good sounds, and they would lose money for the bad sounds. And the good sounds were inherently good, and the bad sounds were inherently bad. I don't know if you heard the sounds. Do you hear the sounds? Yeah. Not really? It was loud. Okay, so the good sounds like da-dum, and the bad sounds like do-do. Okay? So these are inherently good and bad sounds, and they're coupled with a monetary reward or punishment. So people want to get the good sounds, and they don't want to get the bad sounds, but they don't think that they're controlling them. And then we looked at connectivity in the brain. This is on the first day of training. These are voxels that are more correlated to the good ROI, whatever it was, right, whether it was faces or places, than to the bad ROI. And on the first day, there's no significant difference. On the second and third day, there's significantly more voxels that are correlated to the good ROI. So the training worked, and we changed connectivity in the brain. Even though people had no idea what they were doing, they weren't trying to learn. They were just inherently motivated by the good and bad sounds. Okay, so training can be implicit, and people don't even have to be trying for it to work. Okay? The other thing we know is that we can robustly change networks through neurofeedback. So lots of studies have shown this. You train, and you see changes in network that are exactly what you trained. So it's more difficult to see this with the explicit feedback because it's difficult to say if it was the feedback that was causing the change in networks or not. This is again an example from one of my studies. So we know that networks in autism are aberrant. They tend to be much less connected in patients with autism than in typically developing controls. So this is just an example of areas that are less connected in autism than they are in controls. So what we did was we chose 2 targets for our training, right? These are the 2 areas that are the most underconnected in autism compared to typically developing individuals. And what we want to do is to increase the connectivity between these 2 areas to make them look more like control connectivity, right? And we also have a control area because of what I was talking about before, because you have global correlations throughout the brain. When you're training this correlation, you're trying to make these 2 more correlated. You want to make sure that it's really this system that is more correlated and not just everything that is now more correlated, because everything is fluctuating together. So what you're trying to do is to decouple these 2 networks, right? So again, we bring people in, we put them in the scanner, we look at the fMRI signal from these 3 regions at every time point. And every time point, we just look at the change from that time point to the previous time point. Right? Did the signal in these 3 areas go up or did it go down? And what we're looking for is change that looks like this. So we want the 2 targets to be moving in the same direction and opposite from the control region. Right? And that way we know that these 2 areas are correlated and they're not correlated to the control region, so it's not a global effect. And when that happens, we give them feedback. We give them both auditory and visual feedback. And this is another thing. People tend to give very boring feedback. And participants aren't very motivated by the feedback. So we don't actually know exactly how neurofeedback works, but it has to be somehow mediated through the reward system. So you have to make sure that people are rewarded, right? They have to feel motivated. They have to feel happy to get the feedback. So we came up with this paradigm, which is, So you're looking at a blank screen, and then we tell them there's a picture hidden underneath the screen. They have to make the picture come up. So it's like a puzzle game, and they're very excited by this. This is sped up. It's not quite as quick in the scanner. But anyway, it's better. It's still not perfect, but it's better than a ball going up or down. Okay, so when we do this, we see long-term changes in networks that we're training. So this is the correlation between our 2 targets on day 1, 2, 3, and 4 of the training. And this is the correlation on the follow-up, which is up to a year following the initial training. So this went up the way we wanted it to. The correlation between the target and control, which we were training to go down, went down. So this is all great. And this is exactly the network we were training, right? And if we do a whole brain analysis, then we see this is looking at the correlations to this target minus the correlation to the control. Right? So what we expect to see here is this network, the network of target 1, because we were training this area to be more correlated to this and less correlated to this, and that's exactly what we see. Okay, so we know that we can change networks. What we still don't know is what this does, right? So there have been lots of studies, especially clinical studies, claiming that there's change in behavior following neurofeedback. Most of those are very difficult to interpret. It's very difficult to know why, if it's a placebo effect, if it was some general kind of feedback event, if it was something specific about the change in networks that they caused. The study I just showed you, we had a change in behavior and it was correlated to changes in the brain, but it's kind of a preliminary finding. So we only had 15 people for that correlation. That's not enough people. Most neurofeedback studies tend to have very few people because if you're bringing in people from multiple scans, that adds up very quickly. So if you want 50 people and you're bringing them in for 5 scans, that's 250 scans. Most people can't do that, right? So this is really what we want to get at. This is the important question, right? How does changing the networks change behavior? This is not only a causality question, this is also the most important clinical question, right? We can't do anything with neurofeedback before we figure this out. Right? So this is I think the most important question to be working on. And so I'll just bring this up in a second. Real-time neurofeedback is a really powerful tool, but you have to be very careful with how you use it. Right? We know it can change networks even when this is implicit, but we don't really know what happens after we change networks. We don't really know how behavior changes. So the reason people have been looking at this is that we've shown correlations between networks and behavior, right? So this is what I showed you with the autism study. The network that was undercorrelated in autism, it was also correlated to symptoms. So the more undercorrelated it was, the more severe the ASD symptoms were. But if you want to use neurofeedback, then you need to know that changing the network will change the relevant behavior. Otherwise, what are you doing, right? So we really have to be very careful in how we design our experiments and how we interpret the results. And what we really need are more studies that directly test this, directly test the link between networks and behavior in a way that's unambiguous, right? In a way that's not kind of fuddled with all these disentangling the feedback from the task. And if any of you want to design a neurofeedback experiment, then my advice would be stop. Stop. You probably don't want to do it. It's really expensive. It takes forever. It's very difficult to run. But if you do decide you want to do it, then ask yourself, do you really need neurofeedback to answer your question? Can you do this, whatever you're planning to do, can you do it without neurofeedback? Right? Is neurofeedback really necessary, or is it just a shiny new tool that's kind of cool to use? And if you do need neurofeedback, then is the experiment you're planning really going to answer the question you want to answer? Do you have the right controls, right? Will you be able to properly interpret those results? Okay, and then I'll leave you with just a series of open questions on neurofeedback. And if anybody has any questions. Yeah.
So you mentioned in your autism study that the two areas that you're trying to correlate are also correlated to symptoms. Did you see in the when those areas were correlated in your study your symptoms decrease, or did you not see that? Or did not test that?
So in that study, we changed, in almost all the participants, we saw a change in networks. So networks became more correlated. But the overall change in behavior was around 0. So people didn't get worse or better, on average. It was the case that the people who got better were the ones that had the biggest change. And the people who got a little bit worse are the ones that had the smallest change. So there was a correlation between the brain and behavior, but it wasn't easy to interpret. And also, it wasn't enough subjects for me to feel very comfortable with making that a robust claim. Yeah.
So how come in the last project didn't there wasn't like a more thorough validation of like the two targets versus like other potential targets? Why was it that there was just one control?
You can't really do more than one control in the real time. So we played around a lot with doing different number of nodes, and so this is one of the questions, right? Like, what is right network complexity to train? But especially with the signal we were using of this, like the 2 time points, just looking at trends across the 2 time points, then what worked the best and what was most correlated to correlations was using just 2 targets and 1 control. And that gave like a very robust estimate of that network. And it's true that's a kind of a limited network. But as you can see from the whole brain thing, you're not changing just that ROI, you're kind of changing everything that's connected to it as well. Yeah.
So I didn't catch the reference for the cohort patch.
That was Shibata, and that was the 2011 paper. Yeah.
It's surprising because it seems like only in certain parts of the brain, initially I would have thought that conscious control is limited to certain parts of the brain, but not like B1. Since B1 is not conscious.
So, right, but there was no conscious control. I mean, there was conscious control in the sense that they were trying to make the feedback disc bigger, but they had no idea what they were doing. And even afterwards, when they asked them, then they had no idea. And then they told them, look, it's one of these 3 orientations. That's what we were feedbacking on. Can you tell us which one it was? And they were completely at chance. So there was...
Yeah, even if they had no idea what they're doing, somehow, right, the activity might be modulated by some process that's comes from feedback. So,
But I don't think, but we know you can do implicit, like unconscious feedback learning, right? So it doesn't have to be, the reward learning doesn't have to be conscious.
In clinical, the clinical settings that would benefit from being conscious.
Okay, so that's the big argument for doing explicit feedback, that you can then use, you learn a strategy and then you learn, and then you can use that strategy outside the scanner to practice and make yourself better, right? But the thing is, maybe that's helpful, but we don't know. We're still at the stage where we're testing if neurofeedback is helpful at all, and you can't use that kind of feedback to answer the question. So I think we're not there. I think if we get to the point where we know feedback works, and we know that changing the network works, and that's really what's the important element, and then we teach people a strategy, and they can then practice that strategy outside the scanner, then that's helpful. But I think we're not at that point yet. And also, I think it's probably unlikely to work, just because what I was saying about these limits of plasticity. So if it was that easy, if you could just have people think happy thoughts and they would be less depressed, then we wouldn't have such high rates of depression, right? So it's unlikely, and we know that thinking, even in depressed people, thinking happy thoughts modulates the amygdala. Maybe not as much as in people without depression, but it still modulates the amygdala. So if it was that easy, if there was a simple strategy I could give you and you could practice outside the scanner, then you wouldn't need the scanner in the first place. Yeah.
Do you think looking at mindfulness techniques might help? I know that is something that is very prevalent right now
Mhm.
in depression treatment and it's been shown to be fairly effective.
So I think there are lots of avenues for treating depression, for instance, and I think mindfulness might be a great one, but I'm just not sure you would need the scanner for that. And the other thing to keep in mind is the feedback we're giving is very noisy. It's really noisy. So I don't know if to optimize a conscious strategy, I'm not sure the feedback is a good way to go, because we might be misleading you, right? Yeah, so I think it's just, I think explicit techniques and strategies can be very helpful, but I'm not sure that together with neurofeedback. Yeah. Mhm.
But how long do you think that can show? How long do you see what the like, there's a time limit to how long you know that go there?
So in terms of the network, it seemed like they were pretty robust even a year after. And they didn't all come in a year after, so it was kind of staggered. And there was no effective time. So the people who came in like a month after had the same kind of retention as people who came in a year after. So it looks like, at least in the network level, it was very stable and maybe permanent. Behaviorally, then, because they came in at different time points and because our behavioral measure, it was the social responsiveness scale, the SRS, which is a very noisy scale to begin with. And it's difficult to know because we have few people, and some of them were really impacted by life events, like one of them moved, one of them started a new college. So there was a lot going on. It was difficult to say if it was because of the study or not. Any other questions? No? Thank you.